He arrived like he owned everything: the pavement, the people, even the silence that hung in the air. A billionaire, dressed in arrogance and stitched in ego, stepped out of his luxury convoy in front of the gates of royalty. He thought his money could unlock any door, bend any tradition, buy any man. But what he didn't expect was to be met by something his wealth had never prepared him for: an unshakable wall of dignity, wrapped in red and black, armed not with weapons, but with discipline. This wasn't just a man in uniform. This was centuries of history staring back at power and saying, "You don't belong here." And in seconds the game flipped. Cameras rose, eyebrows lifted, and a silence louder than $1 million offer swallowed the street. The morning began with a sharp London chill, but the atmosphere near Buckingham Palace was anything but dull. Tourists gathered early, hoping to catch the ceremonial changing of the guard. Cameras were out, children were hoisted onto shoulders, and excitement buzzed through the air like static. But what happened that day was far from ordinary, because that morning, a convoy of high-end luxury vehicles broke through the humdrum of the typical tourist crowd, drawing every pair of eyes in the vicinity. The convoy was unmistakable. 5 jet black Mercedes Maybachs with bulletproof windows cruised down the mall, escorted by 2 Range Rovers at the front and back. Everything about the line of vehicles screamed exclusivity. Their engines purred like well-fed jungle cats, and their wheels glided over the cobblestones as if the road itself had parted to let them pass. Traffic was briefly held back as the convoy approached the gates of Buckingham Palace. From the lead car emerged the man of the hour, Alexander Cromwell, a name whispered in boardrooms and screamed on business channels across the globe. Self-made billionaire, real estate tycoon, media magnate, owner of the largest private jet fleet in the Western Hemisphere. In short, a man who had never heard the word no in any language he'd bothered to learn. Cromwell stepped out wearing a navy blue suit that hugged his athletic frame perfectly, stitched by an obscure Italian tailor who only serviced clients from a single cobbled street in Milan. His shoes were handcrafted, glossy enough to mirror the sky. A platinum Patek Philippe adorned his wrist, and his custom sunglasses reflected the towering facade of the palace he was now gazing at with calculated ambition. Behind him spilled his entourage, his chief of staff, 2 communications directors, a fashion consultant, a cultural attaché, and 3 personal security guards in dark suits and earpieces. They fanned out around him in a choreographed dance that had been rehearsed countless times. One assistant began documenting his every move with a high-end DSLR camera for his personal brand channels. Another whispered updates from the financial world into his ear. Cromwell didn't just arrive, he made a statement. He strode up to the main viewing area, causing murmurs among the crowd. Tourists recognized him immediately. Phones came out, flashes sparked. A few even called out his name. He acknowledged them with a diplomatic nod, used to being admired, even revered, wherever he went. A velvet rope was discreetly unhooked for him by his staff, and Cromwell stepped closer to the gates of the palace than most ever would, gazing upon its grandeur not with awe, but with appraisal. Like a collector sizing up a priceless artifact he planned to add to his portfolio. At that moment, he wasn't just a man admiring royalty. He was a man thinking about how to own the moment. Cromwell had visited palaces before, Versailles, Schönbrunn, and even the Forbidden City. But this was different. This was British royalty, the living heartbeat of ceremonial tradition and historic continuity. In Cromwell's eyes, it was another fortress waiting to be breached by capital. His assistant stepped forward, speaking softly into a concealed microphone. Protocol specialists confirm no private access allowed. she said, her voice laced with anxiety. Cromwell smirked. "We'll see about that," he replied, smoothing down his lapels before walking toward the stoic figures in crimson red, standing at attention beyond the wrought iron gates. The royal guards stood motionless, silent as statues, embodying a presence far greater than their individual selves. They represented centuries of loyalty, discipline, and an unspoken code that no amount of power or persuasion could shatter. Cromwell, however, believed that nothing was truly beyond negotiation. His life experience had taught him that everything, respect, loyalty, rules, could be bent or bought given the right figure. Approaching the nearest guard, Cromwell adjusted his cufflinks and cleared his throat. There was no formal greeting, no moment of humility, just a casual but confident tone that hinted at practiced charm. "I believe we may have some mutual interests," Cromwell said, eyes hidden behind his designer sunglasses. "I'd like a word with someone on the inside, a private audience, perhaps even a photo for my foundation's upcoming campaign." The guard did not move. His gaze remained fixed ahead, unblinking. Cromwell chuckled softly, as though the moment were simply a formality. He stepped slightly closer. "I'm willing to make it worthwhile," he said, lowering his voice, though not enough to avoid being picked up by nearby phones. "We're talking high six figures, discreet of course, maybe even 7, if you can make it happen quickly." Still, the guard remained stoic, giving no sign he had heard anything at all. Cromwell raised an eyebrow. He was used to oblique refusals in corporate takeovers, indirect hesitations during negotiations, but complete silence. It was not just unexpected, it was unacceptable. He tried again, this time more assertively. "Listen, I've donated to historical societies, funded royal restoration projects in Eastern Europe, and supported aristocratic estates in financial ruin. I'm not some wide-eyed tourist looking for a selfie. I'm offering real support here, beneficial to both sides." The guard's face remained impassive. No flicker of acknowledgement, no shift in stance. The billionaire's smile thinned, his lips tightening around the edge of growing frustration. "I can write the check right now," he added, snapping his fingers. One of his assistants approached, holding a leather-bound checkbook. £10 million, that buys a lot of cooperation. A murmur ran through the crowd. People had gathered now, drawn in by the strange confrontation. Phones were held high, recording every word, every gesture. Still, the royal guard did not react. It was as if the billionaire had been speaking to the air itself. And that's when the shift occurred. Not in the guards, but in Cromwell. His voice sharpened, no longer a gentle whisper of persuasion, but a pointed edge of entitlement. "Do you even understand what you're turning down?" He snapped. "You think this job makes you untouchable? Let me be clear. Everyone has a price. Everyone. You're standing in the way of something much bigger than your little ceremony." A beat of silence passed, heavy and electric. The guard finally spoke. His voice was calm, even, clipped with the crispness of military bearing. "Sir, step back." The command was simple, unmistakable. Cromwell blinked, stunned by the lack of deference. "Step back," the guard repeated, eyes fixed forward. "You are not permitted beyond this point. This is sacred ground. It is not for sale." The air crackled as the crowd realized what had just occurred. This wasn't just a rebuke. This was a wall, an invisible, immovable wall that no amount of money could scale. Cromwell's jaw tightened. His assistant, sensing the shift, tried to pull him away, but the cameras were already rolling. The crowd was already reacting, and Cromwell, for the first time in recent memory, was standing on the wrong side of a conversation he couldn't control. The pause, after the guard's command, lingered like smoke in the air. But Alexander Cromwell didn't move. He was too accustomed to being the one who dictated terms, to having people both figuratively and literally to his demands. What the guard had said didn't register as a boundary. It registered as a challenge. One that Cromwell, in all his wealth-wrapped arrogance, was eager to meet head-on. He took a small step forward, just enough to show defiance, but not enough to breach any official threshold. He adjusted his tie, turned slightly to the crowd, his natural audience, and raised his voice a notch higher. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said, loud enough for both the guard and the phones pointed in his direction to hear clearly. "I'm not here to disrupt. I'm here to support this beautiful palace, this noble tradition. Surely they require funding. Preservation isn't cheap." There it was again, that unmistakable edge in his tone. It was the same rhythm he used in boardrooms, the polished cadence of a man who had talked his way into the hearts of shareholders and the vaults of banks. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and produced a sleek silver business card case. Flipping it open with one hand, he pulled out a card and held it between two fingers like a magician about to reveal a trick. "I represent the Cromwell Foundation," he said, waving the card toward the unflinching guard. "We've contributed over $500 million to cultural institutions in the last 3 years alone. We saved libraries in Florence. We rebuilt opera houses in South America. We even funded the restoration of a Tsarist chapel in Moscow. What I'm offering here today is a substantial donation earmarked for the royal household's historical preservation fund. All I'm asking for in return is a few moments behind those gates, a handshake, perhaps a photo, something symbolic." He smiled, fully believing his words were generous, noble, even. In his mind, he wasn't bribing anyone. He was providing an opportunity, a symbiotic transaction between tradition and wealth, the old world and the new. And he was convinced that the guard, who stood like a lifeless sculpture, simply needed to be persuaded that this was a good deal. The billionaire turned briefly and nodded toward his assistant, who had already produced a thick envelope from her leather case. She walked forward and held it out just a few steps behind her boss. The envelope was sealed in wax, not just for show but to reinforce the perception of importance, of protocol and gravitas, the kind of delivery typically associated with diplomatic cables or old-world letters from aristocrats. "This contains a draft letter of intent," Cromwell continued, gesturing toward the envelope. "It outlines a 15 million pledge, immediate, unrestricted use, tax-free. And if that's not sufficient, we can revisit the numbers. I don't come here with limitations. I come here with gratitude and respect. Surely we can find some middle ground." The air around him remained still. The guard didn't flinch. His expression didn't change. His gaze was locked forward, eyes focused on a distant, invisible line of duty that no outsider could cross. Cromwell's voice took on a more personal tone. "Look, I understand, you have orders, but this is about heritage, history. I'm not asking for the Queen's diary. I just want to help. Do you know how many royal buildings around the world are falling apart because they refuse to accept modern help? Don't let this one be next." Still nothing. The silence was beginning to wear on Cromwell's nerves. His offer to him was more than reasonable. It wasn't just cash, it was cultural insurance. A contribution that would keep the palace's traditions alive for another generation. Or so he told himself, but to the guard, this was something else entirely. The unspoken tension stretched thin, visible in the way the billionaire's hand hovered between invitation and insult, as if he were daring the stoic figure to engage. The envelope was still being held out. The money still hung in the air like an unanswered question. Cromwell glanced at his assistant and whispered under his breath, "Raise it. Double it if you have to." She nodded and stepped back, preparing to adjust the terms on the fly. The script was changing, but the man at the center of it still believed he could steer it with enough zeros on a piece of paper. The guard's right hand, clad in a crisp white glove, moved, just slightly, but not to take the envelope. Instead, he lowered it to rest more firmly on the stock of his ceremonial rifle, a motion so precise, so practiced, that it seemed to echo with authority more than any spoken word could. "No," he said, finally, with an unwavering calm that cut through the billionaire's proposal like a blade through silk. That single word reverberated louder than any of Cromwell's rehearsed speeches. There was no hesitation, no flicker of temptation, no sign of internal conflict. Just a single, syllabic barrier that years of protocol and discipline had forged into armor. Cromwell blinked. He wasn't used to hearing that word, at least, not without conditions or loopholes attached. He took a step back, momentarily unsure if he'd heard the guard correctly. "No," he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "You don't even want to hear the full offer." The guard didn't move. His gaze remained locked ahead, his face a mask carved in stone. "I'm not here to negotiate, sir," the guard said, his tone still respectful but ironclad. "You are at a royal site. It is not for sale." Cromwell stared at the guard, mouth half open, unsure whether to laugh or press further. He glanced at the envelope, then at the guard, then at the cameras, now openly filming what had begun to feel like a historic moment. He gestured toward the growing crowd. "Are you serious? Do you know who I am? This could benefit everyone. The royal guard does not benefit from private deals." The guard responded, not turning his head. "Step back." Cromwell took a breath and tried again, this time with forced patience. "We're not talking about smuggling out a crown jewel here. Just a short moment. I want to be respectful, but I'm offering help here. Real, tangible help." "Your offer is noted," the guard said without inflection. "Now step back." The tone wasn't angry or confrontational. It was final, like a drawbridge being pulled up. There was no room for further discussion. No cracks to exploit. This was not a negotiation. It was a boundary being enforced by someone who understood what it meant to serve something larger than himself. Cromwell's jaw tightened. His assistant glanced at him nervously, unsure if she should step in. The crowd had grown. Dozens of phones were aimed at the scene, capturing not just the words but the subtle unraveling of a man who had never been publicly denied anything. The billionaire straightened his shoulders, suddenly aware that every second was being etched into the digital consciousness of the world. The guard, meanwhile, stood still, unmoved, as though Cromwell had never spoken a word at all. The billionaire took a moment to compose himself, adjusting his posture and tightening his grip on his pride. The word "no" had been delivered with such certainty that it rattled something inside him, not just his ego, but the very foundation of his worldview. Alexander Cromwell was not just a man with wealth. He was the embodiment of it, someone who had built his empire on the belief that influence came at a price, and everything, everyone, could be reached if the number was right. He turned slowly to the growing crowd, now fully aware of the attention his spectacle had drawn. It wasn't just a private confrontation anymore, it was theater. And in Cromwell's world, an audience only added fuel to the performance. He shifted his tone, no longer attempting subtlety or diplomacy. Instead, he drew from the arsenal of confidence that had served him through billion-dollar acquisitions and government negotiations. "Let's be honest," he said, speaking clearly enough for the surrounding tourists and bystanders to hear. Everyone has a price. That's just reality. It's not disrespect. It's recognition of value. He took a step closer to the gate, though still staying behind the invisible line that separated the public from the sacred. I'm not here waving money in your face for no reason, he continued, directing his words at the unblinking guard, but knowing full well that the audience was listening too. I understand loyalty, I understand rules, but I also understand what money can do. It feeds families, builds schools, protects legacies. His voice gained strength with each sentence, the polished rhythm of a seasoned speaker kicking in. Do you think this uniform pays you what you deserve? Do you think tradition keeps your kids in private education or gets your mother the best health care? No. Money does that. And the only reason some people pretend they're above it is because they've never been offered enough. Still, the guard didn't respond. He didn't move. The composure was like stone, impervious to the speech, immune to the dollar signs being tossed around like candy. Cromwell's eyes narrowed slightly. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was a personal test, and his pride was on the line. He tilted his head slightly, voice now edged with the sharpness of frustration rather than charisma. I'm offering you a a lifetime opportunity, something discreet. No one needs to know. You walk me in for 5 minutes, no cameras, no press, and walk out with enough to retire. 10 million in your account by sundown. He paused for effect, letting the offer hang in the air like bait on a silver hook. 10 million pounds, he repeated slowly, enunciating each word as if that would somehow crack the guard's armor. Still nothing. The tension began to throb between them like a pulse. The billionaire leaned in just a little, his voice dropping to a whisper that was still laced with steel. You're a man, not a machine. Everyone has a number. You just haven't heard yours yet. No response. The silence felt louder than the crowd now. Cromwell's face tightened. The lines around his eyes, usually masked by charm, now showed impatience. He wasn't used to resistance, and especially not from someone who, in his world, should be inconsequential. A gatekeeper, a sentry. Not a decision maker. Think about your future, he said sharply. One nod from you, and you change your entire life. This job, you'll wear that uniform until your knees give out. But 10 million pounds, that's freedom, that's power, that's respect. The words hung there, not as an offer now, but as a warning. A man who had always gotten what he wanted was being denied, and his frustration was becoming palpable. Without shifting an inch, without even the faintest change in expression, the guard's voice rang out once more, low, steady, and resolute. You may step back now. The tone wasn't angry. It wasn't defensive. It was calm, authoritative, and completely unshaken. A voice trained not just to command attention, but to remain unaltered in the face of manipulation, intimidation, or reward. The kind of voice forged through centuries of discipline, passed down through a lineage of silent service. Cromwell stared, incredulous. He'd just offered a man more money than most people would see in 100 lifetimes. The disbelief started to knot itself into irritation. His lips curled slightly as he squinted behind his sunglasses. He gestured toward the guard now, not in diplomacy, but disbelief. You're turning down 10 million pounds, 10 million. You do understand the magnitude of what I'm saying. The guard didn't flinch. His eyes were still fixed forward, trained like a compass on an immovable North Star. Your money has no place here, the guard said, his voice firm but composed. This ground, this uniform, this tradition, it does not belong to those who buy. It belongs to those who serve. The words didn't echo off palace walls, but they didn't need to. They echoed in the silence that followed, in the stunned hush that settled over the crowd as they realized something bigger was happening. Cromwell blinked. For the first time since stepping out of his car, his confidence faltered. The words he had just heard didn't come from a man guarding a gate. They came from a man guarding a value that couldn't be shaken by money, by threats, or by grandeur. Still, Cromwell wasn't done. He took another step, now dangerously close to the edge of propriety. His voice no longer charismatic, but strained. This is not just about you. It's about progress. Things change. Traditions adapt. They evolve. You think refusing a check makes you a hero. You're clinging to a fantasy. Tradition, the guard responded immediately, is not a fantasy. It is a duty. It is loyalty. It is sacrifice. That is not for sale. Not now. Not ever. The words cut deeper than Cromwell expected, not because of their sharpness, but because of their certainty. He wasn't arguing with a man. He was arguing with history itself, and for once his wealth felt small, petty, even irrelevant. The guard resumed his statue-like posture. His hands rested back into position. His eyes never broke focus again. The offer, the promise, the numbers, none of it mattered. He had said what he needed to say, and there would be no further discussion. The crowd behind the ropes, once buzzing with murmurs and clicks of cameras, stood quieter now. Even the tourists, even the skeptics, even the ones who might have taken the money themselves, stood watching something they hadn't expected to see. A rich man throwing the full weight of his influence at a uniform. And the uniform didn't even blink. At first, there had only been curious glances and a few raised phones. People weren't entirely sure what they were witnessing when the billionaire started his overtures. But once his voice rose, once the offers turned into blatant attempts to buy access and dignity, the mood shifted. Tourists and passers-by had been watching out of interest. Now they were watching out of principle. What began as casual interest snowballed into collective attention. Dozens of people formed a semi-circle near the barriers, phones raised not just to capture the moment, but to preserve it. The murmurs turned into whispers, then open commentary. "Is he serious?" One woman said under her breath, incredulous. "He just offered 10 million. Someone else echoed, but it wasn't the size of the offer that made people react. It was the refusal. It was the unwavering presence of the guard, standing like time itself, refusing to acknowledge power that came in gold-plated digits. And then it happened. A slow, solitary clap broke the air, coming from a young man in a hoodie holding a phone high. His rhythm was measured, deliberate. Another joined him, then another, and within seconds, the area outside the palace gates was filled with the sound of applause. Not for the billionaire, but for the man who had said no. "Legend," someone called out. "Real patriot," shouted another. "That's how you serve your country." The billionaire turned, his face now clearly flustered. His eyes darted from one raised phone to another, realizing that not only was he not in control of the situation, he was the story, and not in the way he wanted. His tailored suit, the glint of his watch, the confidence he wore like armor, none of it was working here. The spectacle he thought he could master had turned against him. The crowd wasn't heckling him. They were ignoring him. Their energy had shifted to the guard, the man who had said fewer than 20 words but stood taller than a man worth billions. Cheers became chants. There were people taking selfies with the guard in the background, not because he posed, he didn't, but because in that moment his stillness had become iconic. Online streamers were already live. One vlogger narrated breathlessly, "You guys, this is unreal. A billionaire is trying to buy his way into the palace, and this guard is shutting him down cold. Like stone cold. He just said no like it was the easiest thing in the world. This is going viral, no question." And it was. Videos started uploading instantly. Captions flooded the timelines. The guard who said no to a billionaire, tradition over wealth, you can't buy honor. The crowd was growing. A few local reporters started showing up with handheld mics, trying to get reactions. One child waved a small Union Jack flag as her mother whispered, "That's what courage looks like." Cromwell was now boxed in, not by security or rules, but by perception. The same crowd he had intended to impress had crowned the guard a symbol of dignity, of immovable duty. The cheers weren't just for defiance, they were for something rarer, integrity in real time. Within hours, the footage from the palace gates exploded across social media platforms. News outlets began lifting the videos from live streams and mobile footage, slapping bold headlines across the top of their digital front pages. Every version of the same narrative appeared in different languages, crossing borders like wildfire. Billionaire denied by royal guard despite multi-million offer. Honor unshaken, royal tradition resists bribe. Money can't buy everything, especially not the Queen's Guard. Clips were looped endlessly on international broadcasts. Daytime talk shows dissected the confrontation. One British anchor paused mid-sentence during a live segment, shaking his head in disbelief. "You've got to admire the discipline," he said. "That guard didn't just reject a fortune, he protected something priceless." Memes spread instantly. One popular image split into two frames. The guard, motionless and expressionless, with a caption reading, "10 million, no." The second frame showed Cromwell mid-gesture, with "When you realize loyalty isn't for sale." Late night hosts seized the moment. Monologues were peppered with jabs. Alexander Cromwell tried to buy Buckingham Palace like it was a 5-bedroom in Malibu. One joked. But he forgot. Those guards have stood still through weather, weddings, and worse. His ego, just another tourist today. Comment sections flooded with praise for the guard and scorn for the billionaire. People began tracking down the guard's identity, though the royal household remained tight-lipped about personal details. Still, hashtags like #RoyalSteel and #GuardVSGold dominated Twitter and TikTok. Even major newspapers couldn't ignore the story. The Times ran an op-ed titled, "In a World of Influence, Here's One Man Who Couldn't Be Bought." The Guardian focused on the symbolism of the moment, how the uniform, the duty, and the silence of the guard became louder than all the power and persuasion in the world. Cromwell's PR team scrambled. Statements were released claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that he merely wanted to make a meaningful contribution to British heritage. But the internet wasn't buying it. The footage was too raw, too real. You couldn't unspin that kind of exposure. And then came the analysis. Think pieces dove deeper, exploring what it meant when tradition stood its ground. Economists argued that the spectacle revealed the cultural limits of wealth. Historians applauded the symbolism, noting how rare such moments were in a world increasingly dominated by transactions. In just one afternoon, a man who could buy almost anything had crashed full speed into something unyielding, and as the story grew, the message became clear. Honor may not trend often, but when it does, it leaves the world watching. The world waited with bated breath to see if the royal family would respond. They rarely commented on public controversies, particularly those involving unauthorized visitors or viral stunts. But this moment wasn't just noise. It had transcended spectacle. It had become symbolic. The stillness of the guard had stood as a living emblem of tradition and discipline in an age where wealth and influence so often rewrote the rules. People were watching, not just in the UK, but around the globe. 2 days after the incident, a carefully worded statement was posted on the royal family's official social media accounts and website. It was brief, unsigned, and came without photos, but its weight was unmistakable. Service, integrity, and duty remain at the heart of our traditions, embodied daily by those who wear the uniform with pride. There was no mention of the guard's name, or no mention of Cromwell, the confrontation, or the viral attention that had flooded global headlines. But it didn't need any. The message was direct in its silence, clear in its subtext. The public immediately interpreted it as an official nod of respect to the guard who had stood firm in the face of a billionaire's offer. It was, by royal standards, as loud as applause. Royal analysts on major networks immediately began dissecting every word. "This is a classic royal move," said a commentator on BBC Newsnight. "Subtle, dignified, and rooted in the ethos of service over self-interest. They're not glorifying the incident, but they're drawing a line, and they're drawing it firmly in favor of the guard." Newspapers picked it up instantly. The Times ran a full-page piece titled "The Crown's Quiet Applause," examining how the monarchy had, in just one sentence, thrown its support behind the values it held dear: honor, duty, silence in the face of provocation. The guard became an even bigger hero overnight. The public had already elevated him to symbolic status, but now, with the Crown's approval echoing in the background, his role transcended individual identity. He had become the living embodiment of an ancient institution, holding fast against the tides of ego and entitlement. Meanwhile, insiders at the palace spoke anonymously to trusted journalists, sharing that the moment had not gone unnoticed within the royal walls. Some sources even revealed that senior members of the royal family had personally viewed the footage, and though they would never comment directly, their reaction had been one of admiration. A few whispered that even the king himself had remarked on a fine display of restraint and honor. The British public, already enraptured by the guard's stance, now had royal affirmation that what they had witnessed wasn't just theater. It was duty in its purest form. Across the country, classrooms used the video as a discussion topic. Ethics professors cited it in lectures. Even military training groups analyzed it for composure and control under pressure. The royal family had done what it always did best: elevated a moment to something timeless by refusing to turn it into spectacle. The ripple effect continued. Interest in the Royal Guard surged. Applications to the Queen's Guard reportedly spiked over the following week. Young people inspired not just by the uniform or ceremonial pageantry, but by the example they had seen: a man who stood silently, yet thunderously, for something greater than himself. As the Guard became a household symbol of integrity, Alexander Cromwell vanished. Not literally, of course. He wasn't hiding in some distant villa, but his presence, his brand, his once ubiquitous identity began fading from the public eye. The man who once dominated magazine covers, economic panels, and international finance summits was now the face of unchecked arrogance met with immovable principle. His PR team was the first to react. They issued a vague statement the morning after the footage exploded, attempting to recast the encounter as a cultural misunderstanding, saying Cromwell had only hoped to make a philanthropic donation to a historic institution and got caught up in the moment. But the wording fell flat. No one believed the attempt to reframe bribery as benevolence, Too many people had seen the original footage, heard his tone, watched his hands as he gestured with that patronizing air of superiority. Intent could no longer be edited. By the third day, his social media accounts went quiet. No more photos of yachts, private jets, or luxury events. No cryptic motivational quotes layered over sunset backdrops. Cromwell had built a lifestyle brand around himself as an unshakable titan. Now, his image was a punchline. Comedians used his name in sets. TikTokers created parody skits where billionaires failed to buy everything from coffee to parking spaces, always ending with a version of the royal guard's calm refusal. Brand partners began distancing themselves. A luxury watch brand quietly removed a planned campaign that would have featured him as the face of timeless confidence. A private equity firm in Singapore pulled out of a public deal with his holding company, citing reputational considerations. Journalists dug deeper into his past deals, and while nothing illegal surfaced, what emerged painted a clearer picture. A man whose influence had often walked a fine line between charm and coercion. Even within the exclusive circles of the ultra-wealthy, Cromwell became a cautionary tale. He wasn't ridiculed openly. Those circles rarely worked that way. But behind closed doors, boardroom whispers replaced handshakes. Former allies hesitated to be associated with him. Publicists advised clients to avoid engaging with or defending him, and a few even went so far as to scrub old photos where they had been seen with him at charity galas or investment forums. Financially, his empire remained largely intact. But reputation, once cracked, spreads fractures fast. Trust, especially in elite networks built on image, wavered. No one wanted to be the next viral embarrassment by standing too close to someone whose judgment had been exposed so publicly. What made the fall even more profound was how completely unprepared Cromwell had been. For a man who could forecast global markets, who could anticipate trends and sway politicians, he hadn't foreseen what would happen when he assumed his money could override values held sacred by generations. That miscalculation cost him more than a deal. It cost him relevance. And the guard, still nameless, still silent. He continued his shifts outside the palace, unbothered by the attention. His life remained largely unchanged, and that was the final, crushing blow to Cromwell's legacy. The man who tried to bend tradition with his wallet had been turned into a global lesson, while the man who stood his ground didn't need to say a single word to become unforgettable. And the man who tried to buy greatness, he vanished. But the man who stood still, he became unforgettable. Some things can't be bought. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories where ego meets reality.